Our next question. I would have liked to see more alternatives to fast fashion in the documentary. What are some examples of sustainable clothing brands? And how do secondhand retailers like Poshmark play into the apparel industry narrative? I know Lauren touched on that a bit a while ago. Would you like to say anything, Lauren?
Sure. I mean, I have been researching different brands a lot. One thing that I did want to touch on before diving into because I mean, I could just list a ton of brands that I like, but that's my aesthetic. And so I do think it takes specific research, but just to back up and be like, what is ethical fashion in a way? Because I think there's a lot of different things. That's one thing that I learned from our last panel discussion is everyone on the panel was approaching their choices in ethical fashion very differently. And I thought that was really fascinating because I've been approaching it in one way. And then here's this other woman who's saying, oh, I'm purchasing this way. So I found a little definition that is, helpful, and it's kind of an ambiguous term, and not every ethical brand is necessarily hitting the mark, and to note that, and I think that's been talked about, but a mixture of fair and humane labor practices, product sourcing, fair practices throughout the production and distribution process and among staff, low environmental emissions, low waste, these kinds of concepts are also brought in. And then something that's kind of new to maybe hasn't always been included in this list, but I include it in my choices, is size inclusivity. And this type of list of things that I'm looking for when I'm sourcing ethical fashion usually means that I'm buying from smaller collections. I'm really buying from like one woman who maybe has a team. Sometimes it's just her, and it just happens to be a woman most of the time. And maybe she has a team of up to 5 or 6 sewers. These are the types of places that I'm purchasing from, but I have heard other people purchasing from companies that are doing fair trade profits, and my people tend to be based in the United States. I'm buying from a woman in Portland, a woman in San Francisco, different places that I'm following and just really like what they're putting out, and they fill a need in my wardrobe from time to time. But I am doing also a lot of shopping on Poshmark when I purchase. I try to look there first for a new item. But I know a lot of people are purchasing abroad, and maybe places that are partnering with women like the women in Bangladesh, creating the cooperative experience. I don't think any of these are more right or more wrong. I think they're both solutions to the problem. And then I think some other person on the panel, and it might have been Kathleen, was talking about how you're prioritizing, and this could be different now, but I remember you saying you were prioritizing like the specific fabric type and how long it would break down in a landfill. And that's not something I think about, because I'm usually thinking like, well, is it 100% cotton or linen? And, I'm thinking about wearing it for a long time. So I'm not thinking about how long it would break down. But these are all pieces of information that everyone is kind of running through their brain as they make a choice. So I think thinking about what you want out of your ethical choice, and creating your list and saying what are your priorities is an important process to go through for every consumer.
Yeah, those are great things to think about. Kathleen?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, specifically, it wasn't solely breaking down in landfills, but I personally avoid buying apparel that includes plastic. So 60% of apparel is plastic, and I don't buy plastic apparel. A lot of high quality apparel that meets a whole lot of sustainability criteria is petroleum-based plastic, 60% of apparel. And those are the things I don't buy most of the time. There are a few items you can't get around certain kinds of elastic, but that eventually, no matter whether I recycle it out of my closet and give it to someone else or pass it on in some other way. One thing I want to comment on Poshmark, a number of people have done a lot of study on Poshmark, and it's very appealing to buy apparel from them. If you buy apparel from a local retailer who's doing resale, it has a relatively low carbon footprint. Poshmark, Rent the Runway, I think these are horrible business models. They have extremely high carbon footprint. So yes, it's reusing apparel. So it's not creating the manufacturing stream, but it's replacing that with something that's actually worse. Possibly the worst possible choice, rather than the best, is to buy cheap apparel made out of plastic fibers from Amazon. I mean, that would like line up everything bad. So no, it's not the bottom of the world, but if you could buy it from a local reseller, even a chain that's local, it's got a relatively low carbon footprint and reuses things. I love classic clothes. There are some companies trying to do really good work in terms of sustainable apparel and producing sustainable apparel. And I make a concerted effort to try and buy from those companies. And I also buy from women's co-ops and various companies where I know the women are getting a large share of the purchase price, or a relatively large share. So maybe not always free trade, because a lot of things are, the fair trade model has not moved over to apparel as strongly as some other categories. However, co-ops are a good approach. There are some co-ops in the US, particularly in some areas with high levels of unemployment like Mississippi, that are really good to support. Western North Carolina, Mississippi, where the industries have left, but the apparel workers were still there. And so now they've formed co-ops. So that's my current one, is to try to find a local co-op and buy as close to the people who are making the clothes as possible. For which I say Etsy is a great thing.
Great, thank you. Sabrina?
Some thoughts on the second part of the question. Yeah, I mean, the resale market is one of the faster growing parts of the retail industry. So overall, that's pretty encouraging. There's a lot of growth there, but from a rather, low foundation. Yeah, it's overall pretty small. A second area would be rental, Rent the Runway or any of the others. So the clothes rental market is also projected to grow. It's projected to grow to, I believe, 4-point-something billion in 2028. Yeah, so a couple more years, $4 billion US dollars. That company I referred to earlier, that one of Scandinavian descent, that company overproduces garments at an estimated $4 billion a year. They overproduce, meaning they have to somehow discard it, what they don't sell. So just to put this into perspective, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of encouraging things going on as we think about alternatives to fast fashion, but it's so loomingly large that all these alternative ways for apparel consumption are still really in infancy.
Right, thank you.
I would just like to add, I think, every consumer needs to make their own decision and do their own research and find what works for them. I think there's pros and cons to renting and Poshmark and things. I can't argue with the CO2, but I will say that, there's 3.3 billion tons of apparel industry, the overproduction that was just cited. And I believe that to be the largest issue. I mean, it is the lesser of two evils, and they're both evil, right? But I don't think that consumer habits are going to change overnight. People are still going to want to wear a fancy dress to a wedding. And if they're going to wear a fancy dress to a wedding, I think, sure, ultimately, the best choice would be buying local used. Not everyone's going to do that. So I think providing consumers with options as we kind of move towards more sustainable habits, I think it's a step in the right direction. I know that some people might disagree with me on the panel on that, but I think the landfills are filling up. We're looking at all of these different ways, and maybe in 5 or 10 years, the facts will hit, and maybe the facts, Kathleen had said there's studies that have studied this. That's not something that I, average consumer, have heard about. So maybe more education is needed in that topic area. But I mean, I know that yes, shipping something from point A to point B, the dry cleaning involved, I'm aware of that information, but I don't think that I'm ready to take it off the table as a sustainable option for consumers.
If I might, I just think that the business models need to be changed so they are more sustainable, and I think that will happen. So Rent the Runway, prior to Rent the Runway, renting was downscale. She changed the way we view rental of apparel by renting designer clothing. And for that, I give her great credit. My only hope is we get to the point where if I'm going to rent a special occasion dress, I rent it in Tucson and wear it in Tucson and return it in Tucson so that it's more local.
That's
If
a great
I buy
idea.
apparel, I'm buying apparel that I keep for a long time. The average piece of apparel purchased in America today is worn 5 times. So we can talk about this, the alternative piece, but the mainstream mass market apparel items that we buy because they're so cheap. We spend 4% of our income on apparel now. It used to be 20.
Yeah.
Shoes used to be a luxury item. People would have 2 pairs. In 50 years, we've gone from that world where having shoes was something special to people having closets literally with 50 and 100 pairs of shoes. Nobody, except me, I need 100 pairs of black boots, but nobody really needs that much. And when you go and talk to consumers, people have lots of stuff and they wear the same things over and over again. They have a handful of items that they love and they wear, but they're not making a very, I hate the word, but I'll use it, conscious decision when they make that initial purchase to purchase something they love. Because if I'm going to buy a t-shirt at, I'll name the retailer, H&M, for $5, how much thought do I have to give? It's the price of a large candy bar. The pricing is just not equal to what the cost is to the world of people buying that t-shirt.
Yeah.
And we have got to shift the model. Yeah, Poshmark is not the devil.
Yeah.
H&M, however, I would think almost everybody will agree is pretty close.
And I will add one more thing to the rental topic. Another bad side to it is it does continue with that theme of always wanting something shiny and new. And that can be a dangerous mindset that we're trying to get away from. So I think there's pros and cons. I see it as like a transitionary phase towards more sustainable practices. But I love the idea of renting locally. Somebody should do that.
But I think one other thing that's changing in terms of attitudes, we've been living with fashion for about 200 years. It's artificial. It's not a natural way for human behavior. We were taught to want fashion and to want change and want obsolescence. And there was a particular focus on this in the late 20s in terms of the rise of modern American advertising, our gift to the world. But I can also blame Germany for that because it actually comes from Germany. So we perfected it. We made this something that people wanted new, things obsoleted because of a style change, not because of functional change. We are noticing a shift in consumer behavior away from that, away from fashion. And I think one of the things that would be great is if we went back to having apparel designers instead of fashion designers. And if we took fashion out of apparel and started to design products that had good utility, that functioned well. If you look at what people actually wear, consumers have changed their behavior and shifted from buying this year's style to having a personal style, and shifted from uncomfortable, structured clothing that fit a social standard to wearing athleisure clothes and comfortable apparel. So I have actually some optimism that if we can just sort of continue on this path and move further away from fashion, we'll be better off, because apparel can be wonderful, but the idea that it only is valuable and useful for 6 months is not.